My name is Ricci Levy, and I'm the president and CEO of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. We were founded in 2003 to affirm sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. A lot of what we're looking at today, we thought we had taken care of over the past 21 or 22 years. But we're here to talk about what we didn't get to keep and what's at risk. There was a quote in the inauguration speech. As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a lot of things like that. And I am so honored today to be joined by Diana Adams from the Chosen Family Law Center. So Diana and I go way back together. Diana was an early board member at Woodhull. I'm sorry. Um, they are a leading international lawyer and activist for underserved families and the founder of the Chosen Family Law Center, which is a nonprofit that provides legal support services for LGBTQIA, polyamorous, and other underserved families. Diana is a leader within an international network of lawyers advocating for protections for these families beyond borders, and is also a co-founder of the Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition, which works on legislative advocacy for those in consensually non-monogamous relationships and non-nuclear families. Diana is the person I reach out to when I have a question about the impact of something I've read in the news. And I am delighted that you're all going to get to hear some of Diana's answers today. So, Diana, there are so many things coming at us. It's hard to even know where to start. Of course, we're going to have to talk about Project 2025. But I think first, given all the executive orders that came out, we should talk about what some of those mean, how worried we should be, how much weight do these orders have? Will they stand up? And what's the impact going to be on people's personal lives? Just a few things you could
Just a few
address.
things. Well, first, I want to say I'm grateful to you, Ricky, and Woodhull, because nearly 20 years ago, when I was a 20-something lawyer and activist, I had the idea of expanding legal rights to polyamorous people, my own community. And that was a really far out topic at the time. And Woodhull was the first organization to really platform me with that idea and bring me to a bigger set of conferences and amplify my voice on that and encourage me on that. And I started my law practice in 2007. And now, then 15 years later, it was like, that's a good idea. TED Talk. And I've passed some of the first laws in the country for multiparty domestic partnership with Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition. So I'm grateful for Woodhull's initiative on that. Um, so to get to some of these executive orders, the first framing that I want to share is that so much of this is a media psyop. Psyop meaning psychological operation. They're intending to scare us. They're intending to terrify us into submission and compliance, and that's not going to happen. And a lot of what's happening right now is that these executive orders are glorified press releases of a wannabe king who is trying to overrule Supreme Court decisions and Congress with a glorified press release. And we are going to push back at each step of that and make it clear that that's not an option. And so, what I think people should realize is that right now we're in a difficult and stressful limbo, but most laws haven't actually changed. That things haven't changed overnight. And so, when we think about the executive order related to there being only two sexes, um, and in the title it says it's grounded in biology, while no medical or scientific organizations back it up. It is completely pseudoscience. But part of what's going on right now is they barely have lawyers on their side who will do this. A lot of these executive orders look like they're written by high school students in AI. They are not well written. We have the smart lawyers on our side. And what you don't see in the media is this powerful resistance movement and the lawsuits that are already starting to fight back and push back. So we already have in the Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County. That was a case that clarified that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits sex discrimination needs to be extended to gender identity, and as well as sexual orientation. So that's something we already know that trans people are supposed to be included. We already have it medically established that intersex people exist. So their biology argument of biology from birth doesn't make sense either. And we have a lot of leg to stand on in terms of pushing back on this. One of the other executive orders that's really dangerous is the one about birthright citizenship, because that's trying to overrule the 14th Amendment that's been established law for 150 years in terms of birthright citizenship. And that's not the mechanism by which you can overrule something in the Constitution. And he's trying to do that with this glorified press release of an executive order. So there will be a resistance movement that's pushing back. And what you're going to see is long, protracted litigation about these kinds of issues. And in the meantime, the people who work at federal agencies are really stuck in the middle because they're not being given clear guidance on which law they need to follow. They could lose their jobs if they are supporting trans and intersex people and non-binary people. And at the same time, the Supreme Court has said that the Constitution supports those people. So those are the people who are really in the middle right now and don't have certainty. What we do know is that passports for that have an X gender marker on them and passports that have people's preferred gender that's not their assigned gender at birth, that those passports are still valid, fortunately. But when you renew your passport, you may need to go to your assigned sex at birth, and you will not be able to use an X gender marker. I think people should be aware that having an X gender marker on your state driver's license could be a difficult thing if one of the ways that in fascist history we learn they harass people by with bureaucratic red tape. And if you have two IDs which don't match up in terms of your name and your gender marker, that could be a stress. And in future, you will not be able to renew your passport with uh, an X marker. So be aware of that when you're choosing whether or not to have an X on your state driver's license, for example. But for now, the practical effect on people's lives may be small.
So, so I'm hearing number one, passports. Your current passport is valid, but
Mhm.
you are not going to be able to renew it if it has an X marker. You will have to put your sex at birth. And the same will apply probably or definitely for driver's licenses.
Driver's licenses are are issued by states. And so what I predict we'll see is a dramatic difference between states in terms of the way that they treat abortion rights, the way that they treat trans people, the way that they treat sexual freedom, and same-sex couples. We're likely to see a tremendous difference and volleying these issues back to the states. And so that's something people should need to be aware of in terms of the state that they live in and what their state's opinions are on these kinds of issues. So it'll be up to the states whether they continue to issue an X gender marker. And I would just express caution if you're choosing now that it may be difficult in the future if you have an X on your state driver's license, but have a different gender marker on your passport, that could be a way to harass you in the future. And that's something that I really struggle with. I don't love that answer because I'm also a non-binary person. I would love to have an X on all of my documents. And I've chosen that I don't need the state to be stamping something about my gender personally for my own personal safety. This could differ for others, and that's totally valid. But I would rather feel safe when I'm crossing a border. And when I'm crossing a border somewhere, with a an agent at the TSA or a border agent somewhere, that's not necessarily somebody that I want to be evaluating how they feel about my non-binary identity. And that could be a situation of where I'd rather go stealth. And going stealth is the term for people who are trans and choose to be in a situation where they are not trying to pass as trans, they are going into cis mode. Everything's a form of drag, right? And so, trying to be hidden as a trans person, unfortunately, is one of the ways that in red states right now, if you had a trans teenager, that's a difficult decision, but that might be something that is a question of safety in some red states right now, for example.
So we know that everything is connected. Reproductive justice, immigrant rights, law enforcement. I can't, I'm blanking on, oh, incarceration is what I was blanking on. Everything is connected, and what impacts LGBTQIA individuals impacts everybody because we are everybody. We're all human beings. What so the immigration executive order and the troops sent to the border, what does that mean for these populations?
I just dropped in the chat
I see that.
LGBTmap.org. MAP is Movement Advancement Project, and they do great up-to-date mapping where you can click on your state and see what their stance is on whether they already have a law against same-sex marriage that will come into effect, how they treat same-sex parents, what they're doing about trans issues, so that you can kind of get a barometer. And honestly, if you have the privilege to be in a state that to move, basically. If you have a privilege to move and not be in a state where you're a trans teenager, or for yourself with the reproductive health care, if you're a person with a womb who could get pregnant, if you're a same-sex couple and you don't want the state to be disrespecting you and you want to move to a state where they're going to be treated like an equal citizens, that's an option. And I think that you could keep voting. Please keep voting in the state that you're coming from. But that's something that's happening across the country and already has been happening. New York has seen a huge influx. Portland, Chicago, many other progressive places are seeing that influx. So I wanted to mention that, and for people just to be aware of what your state's stances are, given that we're going to be volleying a lot of these decisions back to the states. In terms of the immigration issue that you raised, Ricci, I think that's critically important because right now, when we're scared, it's easy for us to get siloed and to feel like we're so marginalized and vulnerable, we can't think about anybody else right now. We can only think about the trans people, we can only think about the immigrants. But these issues are intersectional and we can't let them divide us because if they take away the basic civil rights and due process from any of us, they could do that to any other group of us. So if you are a, wealthy white gay man who wants your civil rights, if you're a polyamorous or a kinky person, you want your civil rights, you need to be paying attention to how marginalized trans people are getting treated. You need to pay attention to how immigrants are being treated because these are the groups they're coming for first who are most marginalized. And I'm very concerned about what we're going to see happening to immigrants. I think are the population that's going to be impacted the worst and first by these executive orders and these actions. There is a terrible bill coming down the pike, the Laken-Riley Act, which just passed Congress and will probably be the first for Trump to sign. And this makes me furious an academic and a statistics geek. The correlation, not causation, the lack of statistical analysis here, but a Venezuelan undocumented immigrant committed some shoplifting and then later murdered a woman. And that's being used as a scare tactic in the name of this, lovely woman who was murdered in Georgia. Her name is being used for this hateful bill that now would allow anybody even accused of something like shoplifting to be rounded up, no due process, no evaluation if they actually did it, and put into a detention camp on the way out. And so what we're seeing now is that is a dangerous infringement of due process, of not evaluating, not having any kind of proceeding. Did this person actually commit a crime, right? Is their treatment commensurate to the crime? None of that evaluation here. And if they could do that to this group of people, that's a first test. All of this is fascist testing and victim interviewing of what we will tolerate. And so that's why we need to push back hard against all of these infringements. Right now, what we're seeing is in places like New York, they're having a violation of what the Department of Education in New York has already decided its policy, and as in many places, that ICE agents couldn't come into a classroom and take a child away into a hospital or a place of worship. And that is now, by executive order, that is supposed to be violated, and that they could come and be taking children out of elementary school classrooms. So we're seeing in New York City that the classrooms are partially empty because people are afraid to go to school. And then we are going to start to feel how many people are impacted by this who are in our daily lives. The people that work at our grocery stores, the people that work in the back of our restaurants, the people who work at our supermarkets. Places are going to be closed because these are our neighbors, these are our community members, and people are going to be terrified to go out. And we can't allow this community of people to be treated that way. And I feel very strongly as a queer person that we need to stand up for our immigrant community right now.
We call that the chilling effect, where something isn't yet enforced or yet a law, but it has an effect that ripples through communities, bringing fear and stopping you from engaging in your everyday life. Um, we
That's
see
right.
that a lot around censorship,
Mhm.
where just the threat of potential censorship causes platforms to eliminate all kinds of content that would otherwise remain there. I'm
Right. And
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, you didn't. I think that's a really important point, Ricky. And the counterpart of that is that sometimes it's called obeying in advance. Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, one of the lessons of fascism is that when they tell you what they're going to do to you, that you not just try to go along with it right away. Now, there are some people who are very marginalized, the undocumented immigrant, trans people in red states. Those are people, yes, if you need to go along to get along, as I said, maybe go stealth if you need to. I understand. But for somebody like many of us on this call, like for me, I am a white non-binary trans person, a queer person, a polyamorous person who is a professional living in a blue state. I have the voice and the opportunity to be out and proud and not do the obeying in advance. Living out loud as queer people, as trans people, being public, being visible, not chilling our speech. That's something that if we feel like we have the privilege to do so, I encourage us to do that.
So let's talk a little bit about Project 2025, a specific portion of the 900-page manifesto that addresses traditional gender roles. So the blueprint promotes a really narrow vision of family structure centered on heterosexual married couples with clearly defined gender roles. So it prioritizes families, quote, comprised of a married mother, father, and their children, end quote. It states that children should be, quote, raised by their biological fathers and mothers who conceived them, end quote. And it seeks to reinforce a society where, quote, men earn money and women are subservient. So far, Project 2025 has been rolling along ever since we started sounding the alarm on it. And now we have someone in office who is very happy to embrace and move forward a lot of the agenda in Project 2025, even though he's never seen it. Um, Diana, what will this mean for same-sex couples, for polyamorous families? Is it likely this will happen? What can people do to protect themselves if it does?
This is a push backward toward that Make America Great Again, these 1950s images of family.
Mhm.
I've actually been really involved in studying that era of family. I'm writing a book this year. Like I don't have enough going on with the rise of fascism. It's low key around here. Tentatively titled Chosen Family, which will be coming out in fall 2026. I'm excited about that. But I've been looking into what was this era of family like? And it turns out that even in the 1950s, it was a propaganda image because women didn't want to be in those kinds of roles. During World War II, women had an unprecedented level of independence and autonomy, going to work, doing well in men's professions, and didn't necessarily want to go back into the kitchen. And so that 1950s era was not only a horrific time of racism and lynching and Emmett Till and just absolute horrors of segregation, and a time of, uh, you know, Red Scare, communism, and people, using things like the nuclear family and heterosexuality as a shield. It was a horrible time to be queer. It was a horrible time to be a woman because a lot of these measures at the time even didn't feel resonant with what women were actually wanting to do, but what they were trying to force them to do. It was a huge spike in the 1950s in alcoholism, suicide, depression for women,
Valley of the Dolls.
right?
Right,
So,
Valium.
right. And so they are trying to push this backward. Who is this a good time for? It was a great time to be a mediocre white man. It was a great time to be the kinds of guys who are incels now, who can't get a wife to put up with them and take care of them, right? It was a great time to be a guy who is able to have economic prosperity without much education. And no matter how you treat your wife, she can't leave. Um, and I think we're at this time of pivotal social change when it feels like lots of things are changing and expanding at once. And that can feel frightening and alarming for some people who want to push back in history. And I try to have empathy with that. That is not an era that we want to go back to. And a lot of what people value about that era is actually the economic prosperity of having the most social welfare state we ever had. Imagine
Right.
that, a social democrat rather than patriarchy that was so great. So anyway, it was a horrible time that we cannot go back to, but and what I want to keep us have us keep in mind is that Project 2025 is a lofty blueprint for what they would like to do that they probably won't be able to do, right? This was written by much more capable think tank conservatives, not the absolute clown show of second-rate lawyers that they can get to still work with them and his buddies that he wants to appoint to things. They will not be able to do all of these things, right? And it's a threat. It's not something that's happened yet. So keep that in mind. But it did give us a blueprint for what they would like to do if they are allowed to. And we should keep in mind that this is something which should bring together, once again, issues of immigrant community, queer community, and women's issues, because this is fundamentally an attack, not just on those of us who are queer and polyamorous, but it's an attack on women. It's a lot of this is along with the rhetoric of eliminating no fault divorce, which meant that you need to petition to get out of divorce, and they're talking about doing that in some states, a regret of giving women the credit card. Those are the kinds of ways that they kept women under control that some of these conservatives are actually aiming for if they could get it. And we cannot let them get an inch. And at this point, that is not the law of the land. There may be some states that have more of this propaganda about it, but we need to keep that separate from what's actually happening legally. Where I do think we'll see impact is particularly in conservative areas. A lot of my work has been in child custody cases for people who are polyamorous, who are kinky, who are sex workers, and sometimes who do lose custody of their kids. But that's based on how conservative the judge is in front of you and their subjective judgment. And that's something that we could see more of. And those risks already existed before this document for many of us in conservative places. And this is just emboldening those kinds of forces.
So, Diana, these custody cases, is this brought by the state or brought by a quote unquote concerned individual?
It is usually brought by an abusive ex-boyfriend or husband. It is usually brought, and this is my line of argument in many of these cases, is that it's a proxy for domestic violence, that this is a means of harassment, humiliation, control, a threat to release pictures and send them to your employer, calling you all kinds of names in public and threatening to take your child away is a way that an abusive ex can get to you. Sometimes it's grandparents, sometimes it's the state, but it's usually the father of the child being abusive, or the mother of the child sometimes being abusive. And so that's something to keep in perspective. However, I would say this is an example of the child welfare state bureaucracy is already incredibly racist and has already been doing this kind of, coming in and taking your child away under pretenses that they wouldn't to you or me. That's already happening to Black and brown women. And that's already happening to low-income trans women. And now we could see this happening to more of us. And this is an opportunity for us to have a revelation about how much we all need civil liberties, about this kind of discriminatory ability to have this overreach into our lives and take children away is a means that the state can harass and control people that was used in other fascist regimes. That's one of the things that I'm worried about. I'm worried about that aspect of state apparatus being used to take kids away because that's something I've already seen. I've had clients here in New York who are a trans woman, a woman of color who's a sex worker, right? And then they go into that woman's house and it's a Friday and the house is untidy. It's squalid, right? Because her cat threw up and it's Friday. Well, if you saw the number of dishes I have as a working mom on a Friday, they're not going to come to my house and take my kid away,
Right.
right? Because I've got dishes in the sink and not enough food in the fridge because it's a Friday and I just got home from work, right? But they use that as a proxy. They don't say it's because you're trans. They don't say it's because you're a sex worker or because you're polyamorous and black. They use these other proxies. And I worry that we will see more of that. And but lawyers like me all over the country will be there for you to push back and to push back and trying now to pass non-discrimination laws at local levels. And I think what we need to focus on too is what's happening at local levels is going to mean so much. And who is your mayor? Will your mayor push back if the federal government tries to get involved in what's going on? How is your governor? How is your congressperson? The local level government is going to start becoming really important, and those can still be microcosms where democracy still works.
We have a Supreme Court justice who makes no secret of his desire to see Lawrence v. Texas overturned, has asked that people find him a case. What are your thoughts on that? What happens? Are we looking at same-sex marriage becoming illegal? Will couples be grandfathered in?
So those are two different worrying issues. And with same-sex marriage, that would need to be an overturn of the Obergefell Supreme Court case. And there isn't even a case before the court right now. So that's a very slow-moving situation. And right now, under Biden from 2022, we have the Respect for Marriage Act. And the Respect for Marriage Act is supposed to mean that even if Obergefell was overruled, then um, there are 20 states that already still have the same-sex marriage laws on the books that are called trigger laws. They'll come right into effect immediately if it's overruled the next day. And so those states will no longer perform same-sex marriages, but they are supposed to respect the same-sex marriages that are still performed in other states. And I'm burying the lead. We don't think there's any way they could undo an existing marriage. You cannot undo an
Good.
existing marriage. So your existing same-sex marriages will stand. And under the Respect for Marriage Act, the federal government is supposed to recognize them, and your home state is supposed to recognize them. So even if Wyoming doesn't recognize your marriage, you can go to a different state and get married and come back home again, which is already what happened, what used to happen, right? And what is happening in parts of the EU. And those states can be played for fools because people go to someplace else and throw the most expensive party of their lives. And it's that state's florists and event halls and caterers that are going to miss out. And then you still are going to recognize their marriage. So we may be in that kind of difficult situation, but we're not looking at that anytime soon. Right now, it's a lot of theater. And I'm seeing in the chat a lot of don't panic. And I think that that's part of my message is that a lot of this is intended to make us panic. And I think we need to take these signs of the attempted rise of fascism very clearly, very clear-eyed, pay attention to them. But panicking is not what you need to do here. They're trying to scare you. They're trying to take away our joy, our will to fight. They're trying to make us so exhausted and overwhelmed that we don't fight back. And we're not going to let that happen. And we don't all have to have the energy. We can take turns. We can all have a day where we cry and need to turn off the news for a weekend, and then we can trade out. And I think that's part of my message is that we need to, together as a community, keep up the fight. And one thing I spoke to Ricci about previously is that I'm thinking about this a lot as a parent of a very anxious queer kid, as a lawyer and a boss of queer employees who are freaking out and clients, and I've got a lot of work to do. I'm doing a lot of legislative drafting right now that's exciting to try to protect people. But this is an ultra marathon and I need to be okay. And so I put myself in a news diet, you know. I took off I don't need a pop-up from the New York Times or any other podcast. I will come to you when I want you. And I'm focusing on what can I do. I want to be focused on LGBTQ issues and very knowledgeable about those issues, and that is a lot, and aware of the others enough that I know that there's intersectional violations of democracy. Those are the things I'm going to know about, and I don't have to be an expert on every single silly cabinet appointment drama that's happening, right? And giving myself permission to step away from the news sometimes so I can take care of myself. And I think that's a powerful thing we can do right now is to think about how do we get our own family safe as much as possible with documents and preparation, and then look to the groups that are doing the work that you want to see done and support them, whether that's donating money or amplifying what they're doing on social media and signing their petitions, you know. And what I see is that a lot of these major cases before the Supreme Court are being argued by the ACLU. The ACLU is going to be arguing the trans case Scrimetti, that's going to be coming up, but it already was argued in December and is
Right.
going to be decided in spring or summer. And Chase Strangio from ACLU argued that. And those are groups that are really powerful to support and to donate to, as well as local groups. And that case is going to be one that is about whether a state can deny healthcare to trans people under 18, and whether the state has the power to do that. So that's a trans rights case. So ACLU is also suing about some of these executive orders. And then at a local level, there are smaller groups. My organization, Chosen Family Law Center, we have some good news. We've been invited to propose LGBTQ sanctuary legislation for New York City. So that is what I'm working on right now, and ways that we
That's
could try to
awesome.
make New York City an LGBTQ sanctuary city and protect the rights of people who are here so that this is a safe place to come to, for trans people and for queer people. So I have that tremendous honor. We just had to hire a new staff person to do that. So that's a tremendous amount of work, but everywhere that's happening. So who are the people in your city who are doing that kind of work? Who are the people who are engaged and protecting your city and your state, as well as people at the Supreme Court level? Think about who those people are, figure out how you can support them, figure out how you want to stay tuned to your particular issues, vote, call your senator, but then it's okay to turn off the news and not panic. I want to share our Protect Your Rights document one more time in the chat, which has a lot of information about what queer people should do. Um, and do you mind if I get into a little bit of that now, Ricci? Just sort of an overview. I think for same-sex couples, for polyamorous families, it's tremendously helpful to get, and for trans people, it's very helpful to get all of your family documents in order. And we have a lot of detailed information. It's
I
a
was going to ask you that, so
Yeah,
I don't mind if you go ahead and
great.
jump
Great. So
ahead.
for non-biological parents in a same-sex couple, or if you're a parent who's trans, if you don't have a birth certificate plus biological connection to your child, a birth certificate is not enough. It's not enough to have a birth certificate from a blue state, because a red state will not respect that, and European countries don't respect that because in other countries, birth certificates are a genetic record, so it doesn't compute to them to have two women's names on a birth certificate. So you need another basis for your parentage, for that to be portable to other places. So a judgment of parentage or a second parent adoption is helpful. If you're poly, you can stay connected to non-marital partners with things like wills and healthcare proxies for hospital visitation. And when I was on the team that wrote and drafted the laws for Cambridge and Somerville for multi-partner domestic partnership, and that does not require residency on purpose. So you can go to Cambridge and Somerville and get your other partner, who's not your marital partner, registered as a domestic partner. If you're legally married, your spouse needs to sign a consent form, but you could be legally married to one person and a domestic partner with another through this, or domestic partner to two people who are not with each other or are with each other. So that gives a lot of power to have a legal family connection. And that is a status. You can cross borders in a pandemic to be together. You can visit each other in the hospital. Oftentimes you can be on health insurance with each other. So that's helpful things to just sort of think about preparation. And there's a lot more detail at the FAQ link.
We talked a little bit earlier about the intersections of all of the issues. Everything that concerns anyone on this call concerns everyone on this call. one of the really effective weapons in ginning up fear and panic and siloing people is controlling the media. And censorship is a big, big, big issue, and a way that they do control the media. So Woodhull does a lot of work in the courts and in our general advocacy around free speech, particularly around sexual expression. But Diana, do you have a suggestion? Where should people go where they can still find community no matter what? Is there a place? And what media should they be looking at?
What media should we be looking at to find community no matter what? I think that I mean, the only social media site that I know of that is not at this point at risk of becoming state media is Blue Sky. Um,
Yeah.
and then finding the individual like-minded people in your area and getting the hell offline and being together. I love in-person conferences for this. I'm so grateful for online to make it accessible for people financially and differently abled folks and parents, myself included. It's great to have online connection like this, and it's also really amazing just to go to a conference, you know? So I met so many like-minded people at Woodhull conferences, for example, right? So I think finding those kinds of communities because within the queer community, as well as the sexual freedom community and the polyamorous community, I have found tremendous connections, long-term friends, people who are there for me. Friend who's going to come over and give me body work later from the sex worker community, people who are coming to help me watch my kids. This is the kind of thing that really sustains us. And I want all of us to have that right now because we really need to find community together. I'm finding that even for me as a busy New York secular person, that I am leaning into spirituality more, non-denominational spirituality, singing circles, walking together, meditating, ecstatic dance, finding ways to feel the energetic presence of other people with us is something that I'm finding tremendously powerful. For lawyers, if anybody who's legally related, the Lavender Law Conference is a legal conference that's in New York, which is like a giant family reunion of queer activists. Creating Change, which is happening right now, is a giant queer conference with a lot of young people that's not necessarily legally related. So I wanted to just uplift some of those, and I welcome people to add some in the chat of where have you found community?
Community is important for a number of reasons. It's in community that will be able to resist,
Hmm.
to form the army to resist what's coming or what we fear is coming. Conversations like this are another way to build community, to make connections, to get information, real information, not the clickbait headlines.
Hmm.
What is your biggest concern, Diana, moving forward?
One of my biggest concerns is that it's very difficult for all of us to live in a state of uncertainty. Will having a fool in charge mean who's erratic and reckless and ego dominated get us into a war? Will he be trying to claim the Panama Canal? Will he be insulting another leader? I'm worried about war for all of us. I'm worried about a pandemic when we've taken away our 20% of all the funding for the World Health Organization that tracks and world works together to manage um, uh, potential pandemics, which we've already this year thwarted avian flu and more deadly mpox from coming into New York City by working with organizations like this and having, friends in charge of major agencies who don't know how to run a major agency and not being involved in the World Health Organization. I'm very worried about pandemic and uncertainty. So those kinds of things feel frightening to me. But I think about oftentimes the in fascism history, we talk about the Reichstag fire moments. And what that means is that shortly after Hitler was elected, um, there was a fire at the Reichstag, their version of essentially the White House, while Hitler was there, which they now think maybe they even started it themselves. And as a basis of that, they call that an assassination attempt. And so they suspended the Constitution. That's called the Reichstag fire moment because that's not the reasonable response to that. You don't suspend the Constitution for an assassination attempt, right? That's dangerous. And what we need to be on the lookout for, I think, honestly, if you have the privilege to think about leaving the country at a certain point, I am preparing myself to leave the country. If things get really bad, I hope that they don't. But some of those kinds of Reichstag fire moments would be if by executive order he's actually successful in being able to overrule part of the Constitution. That really worries me. One of the others is not just having states being able to choose um, their values, which is going to be really alarming for those in red states, but also one of the threats in Project 2025 that I find most grave is that if local law enforcement, if local district's attorney don't prosecute people who are abortion doctors, trans advocates like me, parents of trans kids, librarians, and public school teachers that share books about trans issues and sexuality, that though if the local DAs decline to prosecute, that they will be replaced by his loyalists who will. That is a moment that we want to have been on a plane out of the country before that happens. Um, and that's chilling to think about. I don't think they'll be successful in getting that far, but that's one of their stated points that they'd like to get to in the blueprint of Project 2025. So we have to push back. We have to push back hard. I think that what we're likely to see is rather than them being adept at uh, well-planned cruelty, then I worry that we will um, instead see the poor planning and mismanagement that could lead to pandemic, war. And also, what they're thinking about right now and proposing is that they're going to have tax cuts on the wealthy and a massive billions of dollar apparatus to put many undocumented immigrants in prison camps and take away all of our farm workers at once and see how that goes for the economy and spend a massive amount of money on that. And they're looking at cutting Medicare and Medicaid for that, for our elders and for people in poverty. And so I think we're going to see even greater disparities of poverty. And I'm worried that we're going to see some more of the end stage capitalism I've seen in other countries. In other countries, I've seen, a lack of hospitals, that people like us could be drinking fancy cocktails and listening to a great samba band in Brazil, and outside there are children who are prostitutes at 8 years old, and there's no hospital for them to go to, and there's no clean drinking water, right? I'm worried about seeing the suffering that could happen in the US, and I think that people may not be fully realizing and wrapping their heads around how bad that could get. I'm sorry,
Well,
that's a
this takes care of any sleep I was thinking I'd
I'm
have for
sorry.
the
You
next
asked me
four
what I'm most worried
years.
about, which is a dangerous thing with an anxious lawyer right now because my brain is a risk analysis brain, so it's a very hard time to have that kind of a thought process right now. But we think
Well,
we
I do want
gotta
to
think about
point
that
out,
and prepare.
we keep saying 4 years. In 2 years, we can take back Congress. That's the midterms. Take back control of Congress. So maybe we're only looking at 2 years and then we'll have more balanced government. So that is something to think about,
Hmm.
is working to make sure everybody you know goes to the polls, and make sure that you're registered. Look at the document that Diana shared, and that'll be circulated, and all the links will be circulated after the program. And what else, Diana? Oh, take time for yourself, protect yourself so that you can run the entire race and be with us. Support the organizations that are doing the work and standing up and speaking out for those who can't, um, and who are staying, um, and not leaving the country, even though for many of us that's an option. It's all about who can do what and what you can do to support what you can't do.